I'm Maralyn Chadwick, and I was born in Brisbane. I'm the eldest out of 4. My mother had 3 of us by the time she was 18, and my father was 19. My father lost his right arm in a motorbike accident when he was 18, so I never knew my father with 2 arms. I was raised with a father that had lost his right arm. He was right-handed and had to learn to do everything with his left arm. I was, being the eldest and my mother having 3 of us so quickly, she was in a flat underneath where her mother lived, my grandmother, my nana. And I was raised by her for the first 7 years of my life. And I was very happy and spoilt. Everything was rolling along really well. Anyway, my father and mother did argue a lot. So my father decided that he would take my mother and buy a house in Kenmore, Brisbane. I stayed with my grandmother, my nana, until I was 7. So I didn't really know my father. I knew my mother a bit. But just out of the blue, I was sent to them one weekend, and then she just said to me, "You're coming to live with us." And I was terrified. I didn't really know them. I knew my mother a bit, but didn't really know my father much. That is not what I wanted, but that is what happened. And all I can remember is I just was crying all the time because I wanted my nana back. Luckily we were sent there on weekends, so I used to always look forward to the weekends where I could be with her again. And my mother and father continued to argue, and sure, it was a big handful for 2 people so young. I do realise that now. Being the eldest and living there, I thought if I stand between them when they're arguing, that somehow I thought that would help. And I was trying to protect my brother and sister. My father never hit my mother. My mother was the violent one. And she would hit him, and he just took what was happening because he didn't have another arm to hold her back. And that seemed to be the scenario how it went. After I don't know, maybe a year or so, he actually did punch her out, and she was lying on the floor, blood everywhere, obviously through her nose, but I didn't know that at the time. And my sister and I she yelled out, "Lock him outside," which we did. My sister and I just screamed. We thought she was dead. And it was very frightening. Anyway, eventually my father had talked my brother into letting him back in the house, and he then fixed her up and got her up and sorted the situation out. I didn't really know my father that much, so I needed to get used to him. And my nana was still in the picture, where we'd get sent over there each weekend, the three of us. That was how my life was. It was a completely different life to what I had with my nana. I cried a lot. I just worried that she would die, my nana would die, I don't know. I just wanted to be back with her, but that only happened on weekends. Anyway, because of all the chaos, the neighbours didn't really like us, and they decided that they would move to the bush in Brisbane. It was only 30 kilometres from the CBD, but it was 180 acres with a little old house, and the house had chooks running through it. And anyway, I will say my mother was a very tidy woman. And of course she mainly had to do all the work, because my father worked in the city with the public service, and she had the house. She was a very tidy person. We always had a clean house, and some sort of food on the table, mainly eggs, because we had chickens, a cow that she would milk, and eventually I learnt to milk the cow, because it had to be milked morning and night so the milk wouldn't dry up. So we basically lived on eggs, milk, what she could find for us to eat, the cheapest things. We had an outside dunny with a tin under it, with newspaper, and it was infested with snakes. It was 180 acres actually. They could yell and scream as much as they wanted, and so could we. I didn't like it at first. Eventually, my nana, who lived with her brother, because her husband was a drinking alcoholic and she had left him, so her brother and my nana lived in a house left by their mother in Brisbane. They moved out to the land as well and built a small house up at the other end of the property. Well, I was very happy about this because I could see my nana whenever I wanted then, but I was, at this stage, I was at maybe 12 and had got used to living with my mother and father, and just got used to the fact that there was arguments every night. My mother had a habit of pulling she'd set the table at night and have a tablecloth on there. And then when they'd start arguing, the tablecloth would get pulled out, and we just knew to pick up our plates and then put them back down and start eating. But they did stay together until we got older, and I never had any rules. I was allowed to run around, go wherever I wanted. I had a bike, push bike. We could go out from morning till night, and no one questioned where we were. There was a lot of freedom in my younger years. Anyway, there was a horse that I wanted a horse, and so that did happen. I had the horse, which I rode all the time, but I had no saddle, so I rode bareback. And my mother said, "Oh, well, you'll get good balance that way." So, and my brothers were riding motorbikes, little motorbikes, because my father before he lost his arm, was a mechanic, so he knew how to fix up these type of things. By the time I got to, well, it was a sad situation really, because in Queensland the houses are up on stilts. It was only a little old house. And my father took me under the house, he said, because my mother started beating me up, and I'd push the other two out the way. And my father took me under the house. He said, Maralyn, I don't know how to help you. He said, I've only got one arm. He said, I'm flat out trying to keep her away from myself. So he gave me some boxing lessons. He said, you'll have to protect yourself. So therefore, I started beating her up to protect myself and my brothers and sisters. By that stage there was another brother that came along. He wasn't my father's, but my father went and saw the man and said, look, if you stay away from us, I will raise the boy as my own. And that is what happened. He was 8 years younger than me. So there was two brothers and myself and my sister. I went to Upper Brookfield Primary School, and it was a one-teacher school, and I never had any shoes. Neither did the rest of us. The only one that had shoes was my father, because he had to go to work. I didn't even have shoes at school. Actually, I have got a photo. I showed someone once and they said, no one's got any shoes on. I said, no, we haven't. I said, that was just the way it was back then. So I sway towards being a barefoot person, because I lived that way for a lot of years. I left school in year 10 and I didn't know what to do. I was crying once again, what do I do here? And my mother said, either you get a job or you can fuck off. And I said, well, what do I do? And she said, well, go into Kenmore and get a job in Coles. So I did do that. Very scared. I didn't know, I was probably socially isolated at where we lived. However, that went all right for a while. I reckon I was 15 and a half. Yep. And by, I think it was 16 and a half, I had had enough. And I said to my sister, I said, look, I'm moving out. Now back then it was easy to rent places, so we rented a little flat at the back of someone's house, and I did change jobs. I then worked at Cut Price store in Kenmore, which was the opposite end, and I actually liked working there. I worked there for about 4 years and had enough money to pay the rent and live okay. My sister then got a job. Yeah, we were quite happy. I never really saw my mother much, and then suddenly she arrived again and said she wanted to come in and clean the house, clean the flat. And I said, oh, all right, not knowing that she actually had another boyfriend that she would bring round there when we were at work. The reason I know this is because the person that was in the big house at the front actually had a key to the back flat, and he must have come in during the day and caught her there with her boyfriend. He did mention it to me, but I really didn't take any notice of it. I said, oh, she was in there cleaning the house. But I don't know, it didn't worry me one way or the other. I was supporting myself by then, and I enjoyed working at this cut price store. It was a lot smaller than Coles. Anyway, a bit of time went by, a year or so, and she said, oh, we'll move into a house and I'll move in with you. And I was only young, I didn't know how to be assertive or didn't know what to do. And so my sister and I agreed to that. By then my parents were divorced. And yeah, she did have a boyfriend that she brought round, not that I seen him that much. She was in the back of the house and my sister and I were in the front. And we worked, so well, I don't know what happened there. But you know, she was still very annoying, and I remember thinking I was better off in the flat. Not that she ever told me what to do, because she didn't worry about that. Anyway, it was there that, I don't know where my sister was, I don't know where my mother was, but it pissed down rain, you know, it just rained, and I was there on my own, and I was very scared actually. By this stage I was drinking. I think I started drinking about 15 with the local boys at Upper Brookfield. But as I said, I had my freedom, so it was no problem. I wasn't put on a pill, but I was very lucky that I had a boyfriend that was older than me that used the withdrawal method, so I didn't fall pregnant. Having said that, I probably would have if because I wasn't on the pill or didn't really know anything about doing things like that. I guess I was very naive. I wasn't taught anything about the birds and the bees. My sister, 3 years younger, got her periods before me. I was over 15 by the time I got mine. So I was a late bloomer, I guess. But anyway, back to this house where it rained and rained. And I think it was called the 74 flood by memory. And there was water everywhere. And I'm thinking, oh no, you know, it's going to come into the house. And the whole of Brisbane was flooded. But we're on this bit of a hill. And even though there was water all around me, it actually didn't come into the house. And I was terrified. By this stage, I'd had another boyfriend who was a lifesaver up at Coolum Beach on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Brisbane. Anyway, I stayed with him for about 3 years and went to all these lifesaver do's and all that sort of thing, but eventually he said, no, look, he says, well, I was on the pill by then, I had worked it all out. He said, no, he said, you drink too much. And I thought, oh, well, that's the end of that. However, it was enjoyable going up to Coolum Beach every weekend with him, because I loved the sun. That was something that I really enjoyed. The beach and the sun. He stayed in the life-saving club and I had a tent in the caravan park. But that was okay. Anyway, after the 74 floods, Brisbane was in one hell of a mess. I think it was 74. My sister and I decided that we weren't happy there. I think my mother went off with a boyfriend. I can't remember exactly, but we then went and found a smaller flat where we didn't have to pay as much money, so we were together again. Still working at the cut price store at Kenmore. I don't know what happened. All I can remember is for some reason, my sister had a boyfriend by then, and we had to move out of the flat we're in. And we didn't know what to do then. And my sister, that's right, she was off with her boyfriend, living with him. And my brother and his mates were renting a house. So I then moved in with him. And there was a pub right across the road, so I spent a lot of time at the pub. I was working, I had left the cut price store where I was working, and I started doing house cleaning. And I didn't really like doing that. So I got, by this time my drinking was getting worse. So I ended up becoming a waitress in Brisbane, in the city. Where I could either do the 4-hour shift at lunchtime or the 4-hour shift at night time, and sometimes both. But that suited me because 4 hours was easier to cope with as I was starting to drink more alcohol. Because the alcohol was dulling the pain that I felt inside, because I felt like I was a ship in the middle of the ocean that couldn't see land. I had no direction in my life. But my nana, when we were there, did come over and see me once a week from the property at Upper Brookfield. Then I did some babysitting, that's right, and she would come and help me with that. I guess I did work, well, that was cash in hand work. I just worked wherever I could to get enough money to drink and survive. I had a lot of trauma from childhood, but I didn't realise that's what it was. So the solution to my drinking problem was I will just have to drink more to stop the pain I was feeling inside, which I did do. My sister had rented a little flat on her own, and I think my brother had moved on. And anyway, the woman there was these little flats in this house, and this woman at the front flat wanted someone to move in with her, so I moved in with her. And she said, well, you can only move in the condition that you have a normal job. And I thought, oh well, that gets rid of all my cash in hand work and my waitressing, which was usually 4 hours each day. So I went round to Indooroopilly shopping town in Brisbane, and I went into all the shops asking, my sister worked there in a toy shop, asking if I could get a job. And eventually I got a job in a shoe shop, and I started fitting school shoes on children and any other shoes that were sold. And I did like that job, and it became quite easy because my sister worked there, and the woman not woman, she was still young girl, was working over there as well. So we all just caught the train over there, and that was simple, and could catch the train back. At this stage I didn't have a boyfriend. My sisters had a flatmate in the back flat, and there was a few young men that would come over and visit, and I got attracted to one of them. His name was Michael Morgan, and I was very happy with him, although he was raised in an orphanage and had similar problems of where to live. However, back in those days it wasn't hard to find somewhere to rent. So I rang my father and I said, look, I said, I need to move out of where I am. I said, could you drive? By this stage my father had moved in with his mother. Having one arm, he did a lot. It was unbelievable what he could do with one arm. But so he moved back in with his mother, and my mother was off with boyfriends, so I really lost a bit of contact with her there. Not that it particularly worried me. So I rang my father. I said, look, could you please come over and take me to some real estate so I can find a place to live. So he came over that day, and yeah, I found a little place, a little one-bedroom unit. Oh, it wasn't a unit, it was just a old flat really, with other flats on top of it. And it was only cheap, and I could afford that. But what happened was my boyfriend moved in with me, and he got a job I was living on Coronation Drive near right across the road from the Brisbane River, and he got a job as a waiter, and I had left the shoe shop because my drinking was to a point where I was partying every night till 3 o'clock and then getting up to go to work, and eventually I guess I was just like a zombie at work. And they said to me, look, you know, we don't want to get rid of you because you're a good worker, but you need to start sleeping more. And I did try to do this, but by then alcohol was a fun thing to do, and I was always going to nightclubs and running amok. I'd say I would have been about 21 by this stage. Anyway, this little flat that I had, my boyfriend moved in with me. And I was very happy there. I got to know the other people in the flats above me, and they were really nice people, and we partied together and drank together, and yeah, it was a very enjoyable part of my life. I left the shoe store after 4 years because I knew I was about to get the sack, so I thought, no, I'll leave there. So I ended up getting a job at the corner shop from where I lived, and I think it was 9 till 2. And that was good because I didn't, you know, didn't have to work till 5 o'clock. And I remember I was 25 and I fell pregnant. By this stage I had no contact with my mother at all. I don't know where she was, and my father just lived with his mother and only came over if I needed help for some reason for the day, and that was it. So basically I was on my own. I remember my sister had moved in with other friends, and so there I was living with my boyfriend and very happy there, even though it was only a very small flat. I actually loved living there because I'd made friends with everybody else, and they drank and we partied, and then I started to feel sick, you know, and I'm thinking, oh no, I've got cancer, what's wrong with me? And eventually, I must have been so naive, because I went to the doctors and I didn't even know I was having a pregnancy test, and he said, oh, you're positive. And I thought, well, positive sounds like a good thing. So I still didn't know I was pregnant. I just thought positive must mean that everything's all right. But anyway, I was still sick, and eventually I went to another doctor, and she spelled it out to me. She said, "You are 3 months pregnant." Well, that was a shock. So I told my partner, and he was very happy, and so I went ahead and had the baby, and he seemed to know what to do more than what I did. And I said, "Well, look," I said, "you stay at home and look after the baby." And I said, I'll go out to work." And he said, "Yeah, no worries." He didn't have a problem with that, and neither did I. I refused to breastfeed. I don't know why. I just, when I first had a baby, I just didn't know what to do with it. But he seemed to know, and he would come up when I was in hospital and do the feeding with the bottle, and the nurses weren't happy about it. But having said that, they couldn't stop me because I didn't want to breastfeed. I don't know why. I did bond with the baby, very much so, but I preferred to go out to work. So then I got jobs waitressing again, and that was enough. It was only a cheap place we lived in, and he was doing a good job looking after Daniel David Morgan, and we were very happy, very happy. That's all he seemed to want to do, just sit there in the flat and look after Daniel. So he had no problem if I wanted to go to the pub at night, which I did do. And of course I had bonded with Daniel by then, and I looked after him as well. He had a sister, and she couldn't have children, and she started, well, I had met her before, but she started coming over all the time because the baby Daniel was her nephew? No, nephew, is it?
Yep.
Anyway, her and her husband were Seventh-day Adventists. Very beautiful people. Very non-judgmental, accepting. And each weekend they would come over, and from when Daniel was 10 days old, they would take him to Sabbath school, which was their church they went to. And I had no problem with that because they were very loving people, caring and loving people. And anyway, eventually they asked if Daniel got to about maybe 3 months, and they said could they take him some weekends, and Michael and I had no problem with that. And I was very grateful too, because it gave us a break. So they sort of became my family. And Daniel became close to them as well. And they would come over on the church was on a Saturday, so after the church they would come over and I would cook them some lunch, and we'd just hang out together, and then when he got to about 3 months they would take him occasionally on weekends, or if I needed time out, and so that worked out really well. I was still very happy living there. My mother had moved to Woodgate, which was near Bundaberg. And she came and, oh well, I didn't really want her to know where I lived because I was happier without her. But my brother told her where I was working in this corner shop. So she came in there. And it was funny, you know, because Michael would bring Daniel around in the pram at 2 o'clock when I finished work, and we would take him over to the park for a while and things like that. And they were both standing there together. Now, I hadn't seen my mother for about 10 years. And I remember looking up and I said, "What are you two doing here?" And they both looked at each other as if to say, "What are you talking about?" And my mother must have clicked on. She said, "Oh, this is your baby Daniel and this is your partner." I said, "Yes." So I was still working, so she took him over to the park with Daniel and bonded with him, which I wasn't really happy about because I didn't really want her in my life. But having said that, I did see her occasionally. Then that's when she moved up to Woodgate. She found a boyfriend up there, which is near Bundaberg. And so I had no assertive skills. I didn't know. I was still young. And she said, "Oh, well, move up to Bundaberg and then you can be close to me." And my partner was all happy about that situation. And so we rented a house in Bundaberg. And one of his mates was with us as well. So I got used to living in Bundaberg, although I only lived there for about 18 months. But my mother, who hadn't drank when she was younger, started to drink, and which was very strange to me because she always used to talk about her father, who was an drinking alcoholic, and she didn't like alcohol. Although she never stopped me when I started to drink. She never stopped me from doing anything really. I had free reign of whatever I wanted to do at all times. Yeah, so I'm in Bundaberg, and by this stage I had Daniel in kindergarten a few mornings a week, and he would then go down on occasions to my mother's place at Woodgate. She had a lovely boyfriend there. I really liked him. His name was Dallas White, and but my mother, having spent a lot of her life screaming and yelling and smoking cigarettes full on, had high blood pressure. And she had, that's right, this particular weekend she had Daniel. And she rang me, she said, "Look, you'll have to come and get him." I had my licence, but I didn't drive because I was a drinker, and I just didn't drive because I didn't want to drive. I didn't want to get caught drink driving, so I was a person that hitchhiked or not with the baby, but before that, I don't know, I'd walked or whatever. So anyway, she said, "You'll have to come and get him." So my partner and I went down and got him, and she said, look, I'm very sick. I said, what's wrong? And she said, I've got a really bad headache. She said, I need you to take me to the hospital. And I said, oh, and partner drove. And we said, all right. So she got in the back of the car and we took her to the Bundaberg Hospital. Well, I didn't think too much about it. She said, oh, thank you, and, no worries. So we went back home. And the next day I got the phone call that she was sent to Brisbane Hospital. She had had a massive stroke in the middle of the night when she was in hospital. I guess a week or so went by and I went down to Brisbane to visit her, and she couldn't talk, and she was paralysed. I forget what side it was, and I just couldn't believe how she had deteriorated. But she had been warned by the doctor not to drink, not to yell, not to smoke, and because she had a high blood pressure. I'm very lucky that I took after my father, and I never had that problem and still don't. I'm 71 now. I was very confused. I rang my brother and sister, and they never went near her. My youngest brother never went near her. They may have called in to have a look, but they said, oh, well, you'll have to look after her. And I didn't know what to do, so I went to her boyfriend, her partner, in Woodgate, and he went and checked out the situation and said, look, she's not going to come good. She was 48. I said, what do you mean? And he said, they're telling me that that's as good as she's going to get. A bit of time went past and we realised she needed to be put into a nursing home, which there were plenty of nursing homes in Brisbane, so she went there. I didn't really know whether she could hear me or not hear me. I didn't know, because all she seemed to do is have a laugh, and she couldn't talk. And I don't know how this happened, whether it was, I think the partner said, look, she wants to come back to, I can't look after her from Woodgate to Brisbane, he said, but if you get her to a nursing home in Bundaberg, he said, I can visit her on weekends and take her down to my place sometimes. And I thought, oh well, he seemed like a nice enough man to me, so I thought, well, that sounds like a plan. So we had to wait and wait. I think we waited about 12 months before. I didn't live in Bundaberg by then, because after that happened, no, that's right, I know why I didn't live in Bundaberg. Because what happened was, my partner and his mate that we were living with decided they were going to go to Brisbane for some reason. I can't even remember why. And they were both on a motorbike. Anyway, I got the phone call that I had to go down to the Gympie Hospital, that he was on life support, that they had had an accident. I was in disbelief. I thought, this can't be happening. And so his mate came off the motorbike too, but he only had a few scratches on him. My partner, being a pillion on the back of the bike, broke his brain stem. Anyway, of course I rang his sister and they came up, and we rented a motel in Gympie to visit, but I just couldn't look at it. I couldn't go up to the hospital. I did go to the hospital, but I was too scared to even go and see him. So his sister sat with him a lot of the time, and his mate was supposed to have told me that he was going to die. So he was supposed to take me for a walk and tell me. But he couldn't tell me, he didn't tell me. So I'm still thinking, oh, maybe he'll be all right. And they obviously thought at the hospital that I already knew that he was going to die. And the nurse called me in for some reason, and she said, oh, when you're ready, we'll turn off the life support. I said, turn off the life support? Why? And she said, because he's going to die. Well, I started screaming and yelling. I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. You know, happy with him, and then suddenly get told he's going to die. And I had Daniel with me. And I said, no, I was too scared to go up and look. But although they did tell me he didn't have a scratch on him, he just broke his brain stem. And I said, no, he'd want me to stay with Daniel. I can't go up. And, you know, I was trying to get my head around it, screaming, yelling, in disbelief. I couldn't believe that 1 minute I was living happily, and the next minute, at 28 years old, I'm told that he's going to die. So his mate, who had lived with us as well, started to... Actually, he was very good. Him and I started to look after Daniel. I think Daniel was 3, because it was just after his 3rd birthday. We had a birthday in Bundaberg for his 3rd birthday, and it was just after that this had happened. So we went back to the house in Bundaberg, and all I could do was drink. I didn't know how to cope with this news, you know. I was just shocked, totally disbelief, and the only thing that I could think that would kill the pain that I was feeling inside was to drink more. Well, the friend of Michael's, his name was Trevor, he became very helpful with James. Not James, Daniel. So between the two of us, we looked after Daniel. Now, he had good parents who would help out, and also Michael's sister would help out when I'd take him down to Brisbane for a couple of weeks at a time. I was still able to look after him, but my drinking just got worse and worse because I had no idea what to do or how to cope. And so what happened was his mate and I were then parenting Daniel. And I said, look, I can't live in Bundaberg anymore. And he said, well, what would you like to do? I said, go back to Brisbane. So what we did is we packed up and we found a house in Brisbane near his parents. By this stage I was in a relationship with him then, because he was grieving, I was grieving, and I guess, and there was Daniel, and that brought us together. We lived in Brisbane for a year or so, and that was back near Michael's sister Lorraine and her husband Peter, and they helped out, and so did Trevor's parents, who we lived near. They did realise that my drinking was getting out of hand. Trevor wasn't a big drinker. He liked to gamble, but that wasn't anything that interests me. I couldn't understand why people liked the stupid bloody pokies. And watching horses run round the track, it wasn't my thing. But yet, together with the help of Michael's sister and his parents, things were, I was starting to accept the things I couldn't change. He was working with his brother as a backhoe driver, and they were building houses. So this house came up. He said, oh look, he said, I'm going to buy this house. It was at Loganholme, just near Dreamworld. And I said, oh, righto. I didn't know where else to go. By this stage, my brother and sister were married, so they were out of the picture a fair bit. My mother was in a nursing home. My father was with his mother, and he only had one arm, so couldn't do much. Anyway, we moved into this house at Loganholme. Yeah, that was good. I put Daniel in school and did the best I could, although I was still drinking, not working by this stage. I would drink rum when I had money and go to the pub. Ended up, my mother's boyfriend ended up giving me her car. Now, after they divorced, there was 180 acres, and my mother they sold 80 acres, so my mother had plenty of money. But she was still in Bundaberg, and there was still 100 acres left. Well, my brother moved into my nana's house because she had had a stroke, and I don't know, just one thing seemed to happen after another in my 20s, and that really shocked me more so than my mother's stroke, because she was my special person. But she must have had a stroke on the opposite side, because she could talk a bit, but one arm didn't work. But anyway, they put her in a flat in Brisbane near where I lived, and I don't know wherever my sister was. And so we would go over there and help her. By this stage, things were a bit blurry to me what happened. I was living at Loganholme in a beautiful house, but I didn't really appreciate it, because all I wanted to do at this stage was drink. And then someone suggested drugs, so I tried them, and I thought, oh well, when I'm not, I could function better on the drugs. So, having said that, I became a heroin addict. Still looking after my son with Trevor, he didn't use, his thing was gambling. And Daniel was very happy there. He had made friends around the neighbourhood and he actually really liked living there. He didn't know that I was injecting heroin, because I would do it where I never let him see me doing that. I had a friend, I met a friend and she did the same things, and she had a child as well, but she decided that she would let her child see what was happening, and I decided the opposite. Anyway, what happened was she supported her habit by shoplifting. And I drank and I still used drugs, well, whichever one there was. If drugs weren't there, I'd drink. And I was still living happily in this house at Loganholme. Anyway, she taught me how to shoplift, because I thought, well, I've got to find, I couldn't work by this stage. I had Daniel, I had too much, my nana, my mother, my husband had died. I just couldn't cope without having something to kill the pain. So I started to do this shoplifting thing, which I became quite good at. There was one stage where my partner went away for 6 months for work, and as I say, there was partying and things going on. Anyway, I met this other man who, actually his name was Michael too, Michael Collins. And he was lovely, he really was. So I started hanging out with him, being a dependent person, and he was very good to Daniel, and he was the one that started me on the heroin. Not that I went full on into it, but I did have it occasionally then, so I guess that was my introduction. As I say, he was a very beautiful man. He was a butcher. And I kept in contact with him because, especially after my partner Michael died, he sort of came into the scene again. And that's when the heroin sort of started again. But what happened, and you know, I had feelings for him. He was a very, very good man. I'm very lucky because all of them were very good to Daniel. But I got the phone call one day, he died of an overdose. And that really upset me as well. You know, so yeah. I had a lot of deaths when I was young, in my 20s, early 30s, 20s, late 20s. And I didn't really even know what death was about. And then another girlfriend of mine, her and her boyfriend were in a motel, and the next thing I heard, they had overdosed and died, you know, and I'm thinking, all these people are dying, what's happening? I thought, my life is jinxed. But anyway, by then I was living at Logan Home near Dreamworld. Anyway, I met this girl that did the shoplifting. I mean, a lot of people I knew that were heroin addicts turned to being prostitutes, sex workers, but I didn't want to do that. And so I started this shoplifting thing, and that's when I actually got very good at it, because back then, 40 years ago, there were no cameras, nothing, you know. It wasn't like it was a hard thing to do. So that was sort of how I supported my habit. By this stage I could look after Daniel to the best of my ability, but not work. So a lot of sad things happened. Yeah, so I'm living at Logan Home in Brisbane, near the Gold Coast. Trevor, and he said, look, you got to stop using so much and drinking. And I said, well, you've got to stop gambling. Because all he wanted to do was, when he had money, was go down and sit at the blackjack table at the casino on the Gold Coast. That was his thing. And I'd get stuck there for 24 hours and I'd be saying, can't we go? Because I didn't have a car and I didn't know what to do. I think he liked me sitting there as a handbag, like having a woman sitting next to him while he thought he was big time with these bloody sitting on the blackjack table. But anyway, look, he was quite a nice man too. I can't complain about him either. So what happened was, eventually we were getting behind in our house payments, and he would continue to gamble, and he couldn't cope and I couldn't cope. So he decided to do a runner, so he took off. But he always had the backup of his parents. And so I'm left there in the house thinking, now what am I going to do? Because it was going to be repossessed. And I had all this fancy furniture. Oh, that's right, and another bloke came along, his name was Ron. He was another heroin addict. So I sort of, he said, we could rent a house together. And I thought, well, I don't have many other options here. And I said, yeah, all right. I said, well, I don't know what I'm going to do with all this furniture. He said, and he had good parents as well. And he said, I'll get me father to move it. And I said, oh, all right. So I thought, so we got a house, rented an old, it was terrible, the old house, just near where his parents were. Because I guess in the back of my mind, when they had good parents, I always knew there was a bit of backup going on for Daniel. And they were very, very good, actually. Very good. They let us move into one of their rooms, and that was a place for me to live again. And we did get the furniture out, but it didn't take long before he gave me a black eye. And I don't put up with men hitting me because I am aware, I went through too much as a child, and I am aware that once it starts, it doesn't stop. So I thought, no, I've got to get out of here. And I had these diamond rings on my finger I did get married to Trevor, and I thought, well, if I go, I've got these rings to take to the hock shop if something, you know, if I'm not cope, because I didn't have a job by then. I was on a pension. No, a dole, I think they called it. So I was ready to go, but I think he must have realised I was getting close to going. And so he either had Daniel with him, which he took over to his parents, which was no problem to me because they were very good people, or he'd have my diamond ring on him. So I couldn't go because I wanted to go with both of them, Daniel and the diamond ring. But after about 3 months he let his guard down, and when I had both of them with me, I thought, what am I going to do with all this furniture? And I remember thinking to myself, fuck it, I'll just get my handbag and go. And that's what I did. I got my handbag and I ran away. I tried to run away from myself. That was one of my ideas of stopping drinking and drugging, and getting married was another idea that I thought would help, and you know, cutting back and doing this and doing that, and nothing worked. You know, I'd always end up back at square one. When I was at that house in Loganholme, a friend of Trevor's came over and he said to me, I must have been, maybe 30. He said to me, I haven't drank or used for 5 months, Maralyn. And I said, oh, bullshit. And he said, no. He said, it's true. I said, well, how'd you do that? And he said, oh, I've been going to these meetings. And I said, what meetings? And he said, oh, I'll take you there. And I said, oh, all right. So I couldn't go anywhere without finishing a 6-pack by that stage. So I had my 6-pack, and I went to this meeting not knowing what to expect. And it was a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. And I couldn't believe it. There was about 40 people there in Brisbane, and someone's chairing the meeting and they're calling people up to talk, and they tell their story of what it was like, why they stopped, and what it's like now that they have stopped. And you know, I said, what, all these people are sober? And they said, yes. And I guess what I can say about that is the seed was planted. I then knew that there was a way out, but I didn't know how to do it. But that's what that meeting gave me. It was a seed had been planted that I knew that there was a way out. But I wasn't ready. I couldn't do it. So anyway, back to where I was with Ron, the one that hit me. I just grabbed my handbag and went, and grabbed James, I've got another one called James, grabbed Daniel. I think by then he was 5 or 6, And I got as far as the Gold Coast, and I went to Lifeline, and I said, look, I'm left a domestic violence relationship, and I said, I don't know what to do. I said, can you help me? And I said, can you put me somewhere? And they said, well, there's nowhere on the Gold Coast we can put you. I said, oh. And they said, but, they said, we can give you because I had no money, and they said, we can give you a bus ticket to Lismore, which was New South Wales. And I thought, oh well, that'd get me out of the state. So I accepted the bus ticket. I had no money to drink, no money to do anything. So I'm sitting at the bus station with Daniel, waiting for this bus, and I just couldn't hold back. I was just crying and crying and crying, and I'm thinking, what if they don't meet me? What am I going to do? Where am I going? You know, I was just terrified. And this woman came up to me and she said, are you all right? And I said, no. And she hugged me, and I really cried it out. And she said, well, where are you going? And I said, well, I'm going to Lismore. I've got no money. I said, and if they don't pick me up, I don't know what I'm going to do. I said, because I've got a child with me. And, oh, what was I then? Just over 30, 31 something. And she put $50 in my hand. Oh, right. I thought, oh, thank you so much, you know. And she said, look, if you can't, if they don't meet you, at least you've got some money to get a place. So I felt a bit better then, and I was so grateful. I really was. It's still in my mind today. And she said to me, she said, when you get on your feet, she said, I want you to give it to someone else in need. And I said, no problem. Which I did do later on when I got on my feet. But anyway, because I remembered that, because it was like a lifesaver had just come along. Anyway, I got to Lismore and they were waiting for me. And apparently the women's refuge had been shut down, but it had just opened, so I was the first one there. And I was only there 24 hours, and this other woman came. And funnily enough, we all seem to have, not all, but a lot of us seem to have something we cling on to. And she decided that she'd go travelling, so she went up to Townsville in a bus, and then she decided she'd get on the bus and come back again. So she was starting to travel everywhere on buses but not stay anywhere. So she ended up in this women's refuge too. So I ended up getting on really well with her because we talked, and you know, she knew that I was alcohol addicted, because they were very good there. I put Daniel into the Lismore school, and I would go to the pub each day, and she would go for a massage. She didn't drink. And but, well, I can't say if it was a sex addiction or what it was, but we were there 2 months, and yes, we became very good friends, and she, not that I knew this, she was sleeping with one of the workers' sons, And when they found out, of course they blamed me because I was going to bed with a bottle of rum under my pillow at night. And they called me up and they said, you know, you've been doing this, that. I said, no. I said, it's not me. I understand they thought it was me because I was the one that was always at the pub or had my bottle under the pillow. Although I did do cooking, I used to cook a lot. I used to cook for them all and things like that. I pulled my weight and I went back and I said to her, I said, oh, I'm in big trouble. She said, why? I said, they think I've been sleeping with the workers' sons. And she said, she said, it wasn't you. I said, I know. And she said, it was me. And I said, oh. And she said, look, she said, I'll go up and tell them it was me. And I said, oh, all right. And so she went up and told them that it was her. So we both got kicked out together. But that was okay because I had a mate then that I could travel with. So she didn't know where she was going, I didn't know where I was going, and someone said, you'll get lost. And we said, well, how are we going to get lost if we don't know where we're going? So we started to travel, and she was into travelling. I just wanted to find somewhere to settle down, but it didn't really matter. Her name was Tina. And in some ways she looked after me when I was drunk, because that wasn't her thing. And we slept on beaches, we were homeless. I said, why don't we get a tent and go up in the bush somewhere? And she said, no, we just keep moving forward. All right. I wasn't going to argue the point. Anyway, we ended in Nambucca Heads and other places, and eventually we ended up in South Australia. Someone I knew someone down here in South Australia that said we could stay at their place for a couple of weeks. And I told her that and she said, oh, that sounds great. She said, right, I will do that. So we got to Adelaide and and we stayed there. And anyway, they got the shits with us in the end. They said, you're good because you do the cooking. They said, and the other one doesn't do anything, which was Tina. And they said, but the problem is you drink too much. And I said, oh. And they said, you'll have to find somewhere else to go. And, you know, I thought, oh, well, that's fair enough because we were there a few weeks. I said, all right, well, just give us time and we'll go and see if we can find somewhere to rent. So we hitchhiked around the place in South Australia, trying to look at flats and find one, and nothing seemed to be working. I did know of someone that had moved to Adelaide from Brisbane. And I rang someone in Brisbane. No one knew where I was. I mean, I went and saw my father, and this is before I left Brisbane. I'm backtracking again now. And I said to my father, I said, look, I said, I'm going. I don't know where I'm going, so I can't tell you where I'm going. I said, but I'll ring you in a couple of years when I get myself sorted out. And he said, all right then, Maralyn, you know, good luck. And So, no, I didn't really have anyone that was... People have said, oh, they should have put a missing persons out for you and this and that. And I said, well, I didn't really have any family that worried. Anyway, so that was before I left. Anyway, so we're here in South Australia, hitchhiking around, trying to find a place to rent. And then I heard of someone that I knew in Brisbane that had come to Adelaide. And I looked him up, and he was also a heroin addict, and he was living in this little place with a gay man, and he didn't like it. And I said, well, see if we can stay a couple of days. And he said, yeah, all right. So I don't know how we all fitted, but he said, look, you can get in my bed. He had a double bed or a queen bed, I don't know. So there was me, Tina, Daniel and him in the bed somehow. And then of course Tina liking sex, that was going on, so I just turned me back and put Daniel beside me because it was winter and I wasn't getting out in the bloody cold. And ended up that they decided to stay together, so the three of us found a little flat, 2-bedroom flat. And I don't know, we were there a while. I mean, I didn't mind cooking. She didn't like doing much, and that was okay. And I would leave Daniel there with them at night and go to pubs and nightclubs and bloody whatever I could do. And found some bloke to buy me drinks, you know. Somehow, at one stage, I remember this, I ended up in this lawyer's office with all these books everywhere, about 3 o'clock in the morning with some bloke, and because he wanted sex. And I thought, well, I'm not going to get out of this one. And then he wrote a cheque out for me. He said, here we go. He said, just fill it in when you get to your place. I thought, oh, well, that's good. So I did that. And many things happened, but Tina and Jeff seemed to be strong in a relationship. And they said, look, we can't cope with this, you just drink too much. I said, well, you drink too, Jeff. And he said, yeah, but not like you. And I said, well, I'll go to an AA meeting. So I did that, and of course I didn't look for the strength. I looked for there was some dickhead there that was trying to stay sober the same as me, so I sort of decided I'd go with him. And he had a car, and he sort of started coming over each day, and that worked out for a while until I had to leave because I drank too much. And I said, well, I don't know where to go. And Tina said, look, she said, I will take you to detox. I said, detox? And she said, yes, that way you can get some help to come off the alcohol. And I said, I don't know how to get there. I said, I don't know anything about South Australia or Adelaide. I said, and she said, no. She said, but I will take you there. And I said, oh, all right. Well, I thought, I don't have many other options here. By this stage, I was 34. So we got to the detox, and anyway, I had to see a doctor. I'll still remember this. And he said to me, all right now, what have you been drinking and what have you been taking? And I had this big long list, you know. And I remember this so well. He pushed his glasses up and he says, anything else? And I don't know, I just thought, shit, look what I've been doing. And I said, no, that's all I can remember for now. And he said, well, we're putting you straight in. And Tina said, look, I'll go home and get your clothes and bring them to you. Not that I had many. So I was in detox in Adelaide for 7 days. And that was a funny thing because, you know, before I got there, when I was at the bus station waiting for Tina to take me there, because I was smoked cigarettes then, I was shaking so much I couldn't light a cigarette. I said, I can't light me cigarette. And she said, here, give it here, I'll light it for you. And when I got to detox, you know, there was a coffee machine and tea and they feed you. And all these people, not all, I don't know how many, 10 maybe. And we'd go to get our cup of tea. I was a tea drinker. And by the time we get back to the seats, there was none left because we were all shaking so much. And anyway, I had rang Trevor, who was the husband, because I knew where his parents were. And I said, look, I'm in trouble here. I said, Daniel's left with Jeff and Tina, and I told his mother, and she passed the message on. I don't know where he was, probably with some other woman, I don't know. So I hadn't heard anything back. So I'm in detox, and they said, oh, there's 2 people from AA coming in. And I thought, oh, well, I'll go to that. And I went in and sat there, and I said, listen, I said, I want to stop drinking. I said, but I can't do it. I said, when I get out of here, I said, I'm going straight down to that pub to get pissed. I said, I don't want to do that, but that's what I will do. I said, because I don't know how to stop. I said, how do you do this? And they said to me, oh, you need more help. And I said, what sort of help? And they said, you need to go to a rehab. And I said, what do they do there? You know, I'm terrified again. And they said, oh, you'll be right. They'll teach you how to stop drinking. Well, I had no other choices. I had no other roof over my head. I'd heard back from Trevor's mother, who said that Trevor would come down and look after Daniel for 6 months, which was very nice of him. As I said, they weren't arseholes, the men I ended up with. And he knew Jeff anyway. So he came down, he said, all right, he said, I'll stay here. He said, I'll give you 6 months. And I thought, oh, well, looks like I'm going. Anyway, this bloke turned up in a combi van type of thing with little seats in it. And I said, who are you? And he said, I'm the one that's taken you up to rehab. And he just looked plain clothes, nothing fancy. And I said, oh, all right. So I got in and I'm asking him questions. He said, you'll find out when you get there. And in my head I'm thinking, because I'm sober, and I'm thinking, oh, he's going to rape me, he's going to murder me. He's taken me all around these hills in Adelaide. I'd never been there before. I didn't know where the hell I was going. And I would have to say it was the most terrifying part of my whole life. And I got up to this rehab, and it was called the Woolshed at Ashmore in the Adelaide Hills. And the reason they got me up there so quick was because it had only just opened, and there was only men in there, and it was for men and women. So when they found a woman, well, I didn't know how to say no. I had no skills of assertiveness or anything. And so I just did what they were telling me to do. And anyway, I got to this rehab, and they did the search, you know, and I'd only been in Adelaide maybe 2 or 3 months drinking. And I got up there and they said, oh, righto, you can go in now. It was on 70 acres. And I walked in to, there's a big hall, and they call that the Woolshed, where you do your learning and your work. And then I went back, I said, well, where's the women? I said, you put me in a men's prison. And they said, no, you're the first woman up here. It is for women and men. I thought, oh, God. I said, all right. I couldn't back out then because I didn't know where I was or where to go. Anyway, one bloke came up to me and said hello. I said, oh, hello. He said, what are you in here for? I said, oh, drugs and alcohol. He said, oh, well, we're all in here for that reason. I said, oh. And anyway, they had 3 houses. Now, they were really nice houses, done sort of next to each other, and there was 4 bedrooms in each, and 2 people in each bedroom, so 8 in each house, so there was 24 of us all together. Well, I was in a bedroom on my own because I was the only woman. Mixed houses. And I thought, oh, well, you know, I've got a bed to sleep in. And then, you know, then I got used to the way it worked. You go up, you get up at a certain, I don't know, 7 o'clock or whatever it was, and then you go up to a morning meeting, and then they, I mean, it wasn't hard work, but, you know, they give you designated things to do, and I mean, I didn't have any skills, so they put me on pulling out weeds. I didn't particularly care. And they gave you 25 cigarettes a day. Apparently now you don't get any. So I was very grateful for that, because I was still a smoker. And, you know, I was getting fed, you know, I was getting breakfast, lunch. Lunch was up in the room they called the Woolshed, and then tea, there was 2 of us that had to cook the tea for the others, and, you know, I started thinking, oh, well, this is not too bad. And I started to talk to the others, and I actually made friends with a gay guy in there, because he was perving at all the blokes the same as what I was. He said, oh, this one's all right. I said, oh, yeah, that one looks all right. So I ended up being friends with him in there. And, of course, being newly sober, they said you don't get in relationships in early recovery. And I said, oh. And they said, anyway, there's 4 rules: no violence, no sex, no drinking or drugging, and you couldn't go out of the bounds of the property. But that was 70 acres. And you could speak a bit harshly, but there was no physical violence. You're out. Or stealing, that's right. Even if you stole a cigarette, you're out. Well, I could make my 25 last, other people couldn't. 25 cigarettes. And I started to think, oh, it's not too bad in here. Anyway, on a Thursday they'd have this thing where you'd all sit round in a circle up in the room, and I guess they study your personality and things like that, and I guess the others in there would. Some people can see what your defects of character are better than yourself, because you don't think you've got any. And so on a Thursday we'd all have to sit round in this circle and take it in turns of saying how our week was. And one week did I get hammered. I had 24 of them telling me all my defects of character. And I'm crying and I'm thinking, oh no, I'm out of here, I can't cope with this. So I went up to the office, I said, look, I can't cope with this. And I started crying. I said, oh no, this is too much for me. I said, I don't even know what a feeling is. And they said, well, you're having feelings now. I said, am I? I'm crying. And they said, look, if you go now, you could end up in the same position. You haven't been here long enough. And anyway, so the counsellor, it was actually run not by counsellors but by recovering alcoholics and addicts that had walked the walk, not out of a textbook, people that had lived it. And so they sat with me till I'd finished crying and calmed down and spurting out things that were in my head, because my head was going 100 miles an hour all the time without alcohol or drugs. And I said, all right, well, go back and go to bed now. I said, all right. And the next morning I actually did feel better, because I know now that talking or crying it out is how you get the trauma and all the pain outside of, because it's an inside job, not an outside job. My problems were inside. And after about 3 months, I thought, this is not too bad being sober. I said, I don't have all the head problems of, am I going to get caught? Is someone coming after me? Where am I going to get the next lot from? Have I got money? It was a full-time job keeping up with being an addict and an alcoholic. And I learnt that I was an alcoholic. And I didn't want to admit that before, but they were all admitting it. And what we'd get, and we had to go, they'd take us down to meetings in Adelaide 3 times a week. AA or NA, we could have our choice. And to meet other people, and then we had to get phone numbers, and then bring other people outside of, getting to know people that were sober. Well, that was scary, ringing on the phone, but anyway, I did all these scary things that they told me to do, and then I became, what did they call me, a senior resident of the rehab, and they take you out on a Sunday in a bus. And they give you $1.50 to buy a chocolate or a Coke or whatever you wanted, because back then, this is 36 years ago, so, I started to like being there. And my 6 months was nearly up. And Trevor, who was looking, I was also allowed to have Daniel up there on weekends. And he really liked coming up there and there was also women in there by then, more women had come. And some of them left because they couldn't hack staying there, and others stayed. I've probably seen about over 100 people go through there at the time I was in there. And anyway, my 6 months was up. Where Trevor was going back to Queensland. And I thought, he said, I'll give you a week. And I thought, oh well. And so I said, oh well, I'll go to the halfway house. And they said, well, you can't do that with a child. Oh. And I thought, well, what the hell am I going to do now? And, by this stage I was on the single mother's pension, because I was sending money back for them to look after Daniel. And I really didn't know what to do after that. And anyway, this bloke was at the end of the program too. And he said, look, I've got some furniture. I said, yeah. And he said, yeah. He said, well, why don't we leave together? And I said, I didn't have any better options. And he seemed all right, because he'd been in there 6 months as well. I said, all right, no worries, let's go. And he took me to his parents' place. And I didn't have Daniel. I left pretty much straight away, so I had a week before I got him back. And he was younger than me, and he'd never been out of home before. He didn't know how to rent bloody flats or do nothing. I said, oh look, I know how to do all this. So his mother lent us the car, he had a licence. So we got this little flat and we moved in there, and I said, well, I thought to myself, well, when I was drinking, I always wanted to be near a pub. I thought, well, this time I'll make sure I'm near the meeting, one of the main meetings. So I said, well, let's find a place near the meeting they've been taking us to. And he said, yeah, no worries. So we did that. And I went to a meeting every day in Adelaide. I put James into a school and primary school, and he wasn't as keen as what I was to keep going to meetings. He said, oh, I don't know if we've got to keep doing this. And I said, well, I'm going to keep doing it because I'm taking the suggestions of what they say. I said, I'm not going back. I said, I've got a child to look after. And he started dropping off, going to meetings and getting a bit verbally abusive and telling me I shouldn't be going and blah, blah, blah. I think he was possessive. And I said, well, look, the best thing we can do now, I said, is try and get a house where there's more rooms. I said, because that way we can have a room each and you can do what you want and I'll do what I want. Anyway, funny thing is, his parents were, not his mother, his father and his new wife were actually millionaires. Oh. And so they paid for the bond and we got a house. And actually, they were very good to me with Daniel, because they lived in Murray Bridge right on the river, and they had river cruises and speed boats and Christ knows what. And so they would come down and take Daniel on a weekend back to their big fancy mansion, which Daniel didn't mind going either. He said, we're going out in the river cruiser and we're going round in speed boats. And I said, oh, well, that's good. So that gave me a chance to do night meetings when he wasn't at school. So sometimes I'd do 2 a day. But whereas Darren was definitely not into it as much as me. And he was another gambler. He was always down the TAB. Anyway, he came back one night and he had a bloody 6-pack with him. And I'm shaking and I said, no, I said, don't bring it near me. And you get a person that's been sober a lot longer, which is called your sponsor. And I had a sponsor and I rang her and told her what was happening, and she said, look, if he's drinking, that's his choice. She said, just stay in your bedroom and don't go near it and get to the meeting as soon as you can tomorrow. So I always did the suggested things because I wanted to stay sober, mainly because I had a child and I wanted to give him a better life. I loved him very much, but you know, you can only do the best you can do. And so he was drinking, but I wasn't. So therefore we sort of drifted apart, and he was arguing, oh, you're doing all this shit, and why don't you just have a drink? And I thought, I'll stuff this. I thought, if I stay here much longer, I'll be bloody drinking next. So I did the same thing again, because it was all his furniture. I grabbed my handbag and I took off again, and I went to a meeting and told them I had nowhere to live, and you know, people were saying, look, you can stay at my place for a couple of days, and someone's saying this. So what I did with Daniel is I did couch surfing around AA people's places that were sober. And that's what I did. And anyway, by this stage, the rehab realised that I was one of the ones that was staying sober. And they said, look, we know what's going on. We keep an eye on, and also you could ring them if you had any problems, which I had done too. It was called reaching out for help when you're in trouble, because I mean, the cravings of alcohol did not stop. I mean, I still had them, but I just didn't act on it. I would ring someone, go to a meeting, read some of the literature, pray. They told me to find a God of my own understanding that was positive and outside of myself. And I thought, oh well, I don't know what I'm praying to, but I can do that. So I did, because I didn't have a religious childhood. Some of the ones that did have a religious childhood found it very difficult to find a God of their own understanding. But I didn't have a problem. I thought, well, if someone's up there looking after me, I'll pray. And praying did seem to work. Was one of the tools. What you learn is tools of how to cope when you get the cravings. And so they put in for a housing trust for me. They said, look, you're one of the, well, there was 3 of them that died that I was in the rehab with. One overdosed, one hung himself, and the other one got a pair of scissors and slit his throat. You know, I mean, I did watch a lot of people die, and other people that went back to drinking. I don't know what happened to them. But, you know, my focus was on staying sober and being around the people that were sober and clean of drugs. And they said to me, don't hang around out the outskirts. The wolves will get you. They said, stay in the middle of the pack. And, you know, I did do all these suggested things. I couldn't believe it. I actually got a housing trust in Adelaide that I could move into on my own. Oh, I cried because I was so grateful. I've never had tears of being grateful before. And you know, I moved in there, I had nothing. And I rang the salvos and they gave me a table and a bed. And I still had this diamond ring on my finger. So I hocked that in for a TV for Daniel. And of course I had to have the phone on. And I didn't care that that's all I had. It did not worry me. All I knew is I had a roof over my head again. And I was so grateful. But anyway, Darren kept coming up visiting me. And not drinking when he'd come and visit me. And I'm thinking, oh, I must be still in the relationship. I didn't know. I don't know. I didn't really care. I just wanted to stay sober and clean of drugs. The drugs were easy to give up. It was always the alcohol that entered my head. I don't know why. So I mainly went to AA then, and you know, they have 12 steps that you work with your sponsor. And the first step, which I did in the rehab, is we admitted we are powerless over alcohol and our lives have become unmanageable. Well, I didn't have a problem with that. I could see my life was unmanageable. And the second step was a higher power of our own understanding will restore us to sanity. And and they told me that when you go insane with drinking thoughts or shit going on in your head, do something like ring someone, pray, read literature, talk, go to a meeting. And I had all these tools on board that I knew what to do. And Daniel did come to a lot of meetings with me, actually. And he would just sit there and, by this stage, I don't know, maybe he was 8. And was just so grateful that I had a roof over my head. I did not worry that I had no fancy furniture. I just had the basic things, and I didn't want anything else. I really didn't, because I thought I've lost that much over my years. I would rather just have this, because I don't want to lose everything again. So we just lived like that, and anyway, I put him in school again near where this housing trust was, in Campbelltown, Adelaide. And he'd only been there a couple of days, and he brought this kid home with him. And the kid's name was Tim. He said, this is a really good school. I've met a really good friend. And I said, well, that's good. And so he brought Tim home, and Tim's mother was actually a drinking alcoholic. And Tim said, I don't really want to go home. I'd rather stay here with Daniel and you. And I said, there's plenty of room in here. And so I went and saw his mother, and his mother said, most of the time he's in childcare with Maxine. So I met Maxine, and she was a very big woman, but she was lovely too. And she said, look, it'd be fantastic if you could have Tim there. She said, because I felt sorry for him, and he's been living with me. She said, but if you can let him live with you, she said, I'll come and take them to school and make sure they've got lunch. And I thought, well, that sounds like a pretty good deal, because I was eating toast and 2-minute noodles. I remember Daniel said to me once, he said, this is before Maxine came along, he said, you're sending me to school with no lunch. And I said, I don't have lunch either. I said, we've got to pay our rent. I said, that's the main thing, to have a roof over our heads. All right, I don't know. And so Tim moved in with us, and then that became easier, because Maxine was very happy that I would let Tim stay in the house. So she started taking him to school and giving him a bit of money, or giving him lunch, and things started to get easier, and I got on really well with her. And I also, funnily enough, even though I was in housing trust, all the people in the other housing trusts around me, they didn't drink. So I ended up making friends with them all. And it's an anonymous program. You don't have to tell people that you're an alcoholic or recovering alcoholic, but I didn't have a problem, and we were in and out of each other's houses all the time, and I thought it was bloody great living there. I really liked it, and Darren had sometimes come up on weekends, because his parents bought him a house and all his furniture and everything he had. And he didn't like me going to his place, so sometimes he'd come up on a weekend. As long as he didn't drink, it didn't worry me, but I thought I was still in the relationship, not that it particularly worried me too much. I was 6 years sober by that now. I remember my first year sober, because I used to go to the women's meeting a lot, because I wanted to connect with women. And when I was, because we keep our date of when we got sober. And when I was 1 year sober, they made me this beautiful cake with a candle on it. And all sang happy birthday to me because I was 1 year sober, and you know, I was crying through happiness. I used to cry through happiness instead of crying through because of all the pain I felt, you know, because I was starting to get my life together. And Daniel was happy because he found a mate, which was Tim. And also Maxine had, because Daniel had a little TV, and Maxine had bring him some video games and stuff like that. And things were starting to go really well. And then at 6 years sober, I fell pregnant. I think it was 6 years, I was 40 by then. I thought, oh no, what am I going to do now? So I told him, I told Maxine first, and she said, look, she said, it'll be all right. She said, you'll get you'll get daycare, and she said, when you're ready, she said, I'll look after him for you if you go out to work. And I said, oh, I thought, well, that sounded all right, because I really liked her anyway. And so I told Darren. Oh, he was angry. He said, well, what'd you do that for? I said, well, I don't know. I said, it's not my fucking fault. And by this stage, he was living in his own house. So I decided to go ahead with the pregnancy, and James was born. And he was up the hospital all the time, you know, handing out cigars and carrying on like he was a big, you know, big note in himself, the ego. And so anyway, he comes and picks me up and takes me home to my place. And then he says, well, that's it. He said, I'm out of here. I said, what do you mean? He said, I'm going. And I thought, oh, well, I've already raised one on my own, I'll do it again. And Maxine was a big help. She really was. And I got subsidised by the government for her to look after him. And by then I did house cleaning to start with, to try and get a bit extra money. And then I started doing courses to try and better myself. I did a Reiki, it was called, hands-on healing. And I did reflexology and massage. And I was still doing house cleaning. And Daniel was quite happy because he was at home with Tim, who'd moved in with us. And anyway, I used to see this little girl wandering around the streets. And I went out one day and I said, are you all right? And she said, well, I'm looking for my mum. And I said, oh, I said, you've lost your mum. And she said, no. She said, I'm looking for mum because she's lost. And I said, oh. I said, well, would you like a drink? You know, so she came in. She just lived round the corner. Anyway, I found out that her mother was from Timor and could not speak a word of English. So she couldn't talk to her mother, but her father had just died of a heart attack. And she was left with her mother. And she said, my dad's died and I can't understand what my mother's talking about. And I thought, oh, poor little girl. I said, so I went round to investigate, and they had nothing either. They were eating 2-minute noodles as well. And the mother couldn't speak. The only thing she could say is yes or smoke, because she was a heavy tobacco smoker. And I said, what do you want to do? And she said, well, I want to stay with Mum. And I said, well, I'm only round the corner, a few houses around. I said, if you ever need anything, just come round and see me. So because I got on with the street, we all, well, especially me, she sort of lived between with me and with her mother. So I had another one then. And anyway, so these millionaire parents of Darren's tried to prove me an unfit mother and all the rest of it, and carried on and would yell at me, look at the way you're living. And I thought, well, you know, who cares if I've only got a couple of beds and a TV and a bloody table and chairs? Because they were millionaires. Anyway, they tried their hardest to prove me unfit, but they couldn't do it, because I wasn't an unfit mother. By this stage I was, 6 years sober, and I was still going to Alcoholics Anonymous, probably 5 times a week by then. And I'd stay home on the weekends with the kids. Well, I had a baby then. And so, anyway, I had this baby, and Daniel and I was Daniel was 14, 15 by then. Anyway, he was hanging around girls and boys and whatever he was doing. I said, look, as long as you tell me what you're doing, I won't stay at home worrying. I said, because if you stay out at someone's place, I said, please just let me know that you're safe. And I told him the story of the birds and the bees, and showed him how to use condoms and things like that. And so at 15 he comes home. And he said, I'm not going to high school. I said, oh, why not? I don't like it, I'm not going. And I said, well, you've got 2 choices. I said, you can go and see a psychiatrist, or you can go to high school. This must have been before, when he finished primary school. And he said, all right. He said, I'll go and see a psychiatrist. And I thought, well, that might help sort his problems out, because I was sorting mine out through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And anyway, I took him in there, and there was this psychiatrist, and there was all these other people in the room as well. And I didn't mind this psychiatrist. I thought, oh, he seems all right. And I said, well, would you be willing to see my son on a regular basis? And he said, well, it's not something I usually do. He said, but yes, I will. And I said, oh, well, that's good. And so Daniel would go in there, every couple of weeks, or sometimes he'd miss, but he kept it up for about 5 years. So I got to know this psychiatrist. I'd just sit out in the waiting room, and he'd go in, because this is what he chose to do instead of going to high school. And then I had the truant officers coming round telling me he should be going to high school. So I told the psychiatrist, and he said, oh, no problem. He said, I'll write you a letter. He said, no point sending him to school if he's just going to be there misbehave. So that got rid of him, the truant officer. So things, slowly things are starting to work out. And Tim was still there and Becky was there all the time. And then I was helping her mother because her mother didn't know what to do either. And so I had this baby as well, and Daniel and Becky became very helpful, and also another a teenager across the road used to like coming in and helping, and I was very happy there. But except for all this bullshit that was going on about trying to prove me an unfit mother, which they couldn't do. And then the stepmother had come down, look at the way you live, you're disgusting, look at the clothes you wear. I said, I haven't got money for other clothes. Because by then I had to stop shoplifting because I wanted to start doing the right things in life instead of my old way. So basically I've lived 2 lives in one. And anyway, I of course, Daniel run amok at times. And I'd ring the psychiatrist. I couldn't believe it. He was quite happy to talk to me on the phone. And then he said, oh look, I'll be going to, I don't know where, Melbourne or something. He said for a couple of weeks. He said, but here's my mobile number if you need help. And I thought, oh, can't believe this. He said, I'm actually the head psychiatrist of Australia for adolescents. And I thought, shit, I struck a good one there. He said, I normally don't have one patient like your son. He said, but when you asked, I felt like I could do that. And he went beyond his call of duty to be there for me. And he was really nice too because Daniel was running amok as a young teenager, and I forget, he ended up in the hospital at one point. I think he drank too much or something. Because one of my rules was, always has been, and it's up to other people what they do, I do not judge, but my rule is no alcohol in the house, and I still have that rule. And I said, if you do other things, I said, I can't stop you, but I do not want alcohol around me. And my son, Daniel, understood that because he didn't want me going back to it either. So as a consequence of that, neither of my sons drink, but they did start smoking the cannabis. Well, it wasn't really a problem of mine, so I said, well, I'd do it out the back, I compromised. I said, as long as you don't bring alcohol in here, I said, I won't stop you doing whatever else you want to do. And they agreed to that. And they have always stuck to that. And they're not drinkers because of it. I don't know. I think he broke his arm. I can't remember how he ended up in hospital. But anyway, they rang me and I went to the hospital. By then I'd had enough money to buy an old car. The funny thing is, I got my licence when I was 18, but I never drove because I was a drinker and I didn't want to drive being drunk. I must be the only one in Alcoholics Anonymous that hasn't got a DUI. But so I had enough money to buy an old car, and because it had been so long since I'd driven, I thought, and it was a manual, but I did learn to drive in a manual, so I started driving round the block and driving a bit further and a bit further, and I had the licence, not a mark against my licence. So that was good. I didn't have to worry about getting a licence. So anyway, he's in hospital, and I went to see him, and he grabbed my arm. I don't know, they had him on some trolley wheeling him somewhere. I honestly can't remember what this one was for. He did plenty of silly things. And he grabbed my arm, he said, "I'm not letting my mum go." And I said, "You have to let your mum go, you're in hospital." He said, "I'm not letting mum go." And I thought, oh, I better ring the psychiatrist about this. Anyway, he talked to Daniel. He said, "Look, you'll have to let your mum go. She'll come back and see you tomorrow anyway." So he let me go, and he said, "Well, I'm coming home with you then, Mum. I'm not staying here." And I said, "Well, you have to stay here." Anyway, that night, somehow he got out of the bed, slid around along the floor until he got out of the hospital. Then he walked home in his underpants along the O-Bahn track until he got home, and I hear this knock on the door at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I said, "Who is it?" He said, "It's Daniel." He said, "I told you I was coming home to you." So I rang the psychiatrist again, and he laughed. He said, "Oh, well, you know, teenage boys are teenage boys." Anyway, so at 15 he has this girlfriend, and I want to go up and see, I better not say the professional person's name, but he was a professor in psychiatry. The psychiatrist was very supportive, and then he did, at 15 he comes home. He said, "I want to go and see the psychiatrist." I won't say the psychiatrist's name. So I took him in there, and he said, "Oh, Professor so-and-so says that I have to tell you." I said, "Tell me what?" He said, "I got Sarah pregnant." I'm driving, mind you, when he tells me. And I pulled over to the side. I said, "Are you joking?" I said, "I told you what to do with the condoms." He said, "I didn't know I could get a girl pregnant." Oh. All right. Well, so we get home, and I had to accept it. And James was only about 6-7 months old, and Daniel was looking after him when I was going to work, and Becky and her other friend, and the neighbours around where I lived at Campbelltown, and house cleaning and doing these courses. So the next thing, we had 2 babies on our hands. She had the baby. It was a girl, Jasmine Jade, and there was times he moved in with her mother, and she moved in with me, and then they decided they'd get a place of their own. And oh, that's right. I still don't remember what this one was over either, but he'd done something wrong, as teenagers do. I don't know, he might have stole a push bike or something. I can't remember what it was. And I seemed to be in that children's court all the time with him over silly little things. I was actually in there when I was 9 months pregnant at one stage, and they were so worried they were ready to ring an ambulance if I went into labour. And I used to put my hand up in the court. I didn't know to stand up, and tell them my side of what his psychiatrist had said. And because they're just learny lawyers in there in the children's court. And the judge actually said to the lawyer, I don't know what she said, he said, "How stupid of you." He said, "Not listening to his mother." Because I'm saying what the psychiatrist has said to say. And I always seem to be in there, just do stupid little things. And one day I said, "No, look, I can't have him back." I said, "You'll have to put him in foster care." I said, I can't cope with this anymore." And so he's in the court, in the box there, and he's yelling out, "Mum, they rolled me in the van and they took me good shoes off me." And he's crying. And then I felt sorry for him. I said, "Look," I said, "I think I'll take him home." And they said, "Well, we've gone to all this trouble, blah, blah, blah." I said, "Oh, well, I'll take him home." I said, anyway, he ended up rolling my car because he stole that and teenage stuff. But he basically was a good boy. He did well looking after James when I had to go to work, cleaning. And then we had 2 babies, so Sarah moved in with us again. And I had Becky, Tim, Sarah and 2 babies. Then they got a house of their own, and that didn't work out. He kept wanting to come back home. And, oh, that's right. And then that thing came out where they put a bracelet around their leg, but they didn't have the bracelets. He was on the front page of the newspaper. He was the first one they ever tried on the bracelet, but they didn't have the bracelet because they weren't made. But they said they'd try him out. And I said, "You have to stay over with your girlfriend. You can't come running back when you have an argument with her." But of course he did keep running back. So I'd get him in the car and take him back there. And then he'd come back again. And I said, "Look," I said, "you can't keep fucking doing this." I said, "Work out which way you're going to be." And he said, I said, "You can't stay here. By law, you have to be with your girlfriend." And he said, "Well, I'm not staying there." And I said, "Well, I'll take you up to the police station and you can tell them." He said, "All right." So I took him up to the police station, and he walked in and he said, "I'm not staying with my girlfriend, and Mum said I had to be honest." So they put him in the boys' home only for a few weeks. Oh, anyway, he grew out of all of that, and I was still haunted by Darren and his millionaire parents. And I couldn't handle it any longer, so I put in for a transfer in my housing trust. So I got transferred to somewhere else. But I didn't like it there. I didn't like the people that were around me, and some were drinking, and it wasn't as nice as where I was before. So I was working with another older member of AA who had a shop in the Adelaide Arcade, and she was doing card readings. And I said, and she said, well look, would you come in as the receptionist? Because it was only a little shop. I said, yeah, no worries. And then she realised I could do this healing that I did the courses for, and reflexology, and I had my certificates, and she said, oh, this would go great. She says, there's a little room there. She said, I'll do the readings and you can do the healing and we'll put a bit more money on. I wasn't worried, it was a job to me. And that went really well. I actually loved working there, and Maxine and the kids looked after James, and I don't know, I worked there for about 5 years or so, and then she said, oh, I want to go bigger. I said, what do you mean bigger? And she said, I want to go down to Glenelg and sell things as well. And I said, oh, all right. But then she got sick, and she was in hospital a lot. She had cancer. And I'm running the shop, and she said, well, you're going to have to do the readings. I said, I can't do that. And she said, you will do it. Oh. I said, look, I don't know what the cards mean or anything. She said, just look at them and start talking. So she threw me in the deep end. So I thought, oh, well, I'll give it a go. I couldn't believe it. People are actually, when she got out of hospital, they're asking for me and not her. And she said, oh, well, you must have done a good job. I said, yeah, well, I said, it's up to you to do that part. I don't want to. I just looked at the cards and started talking, but I found that most people, all they wanted to do was tell me all their problems, and I'd say a few things here and there, and then they'd go, and it was like telling someone that they never have to see again. And that's basically what it was for me. I'd just say a few things and pull a bit more, what was that like for you? And then, and then she went on TV, and then I didn't know it, but I had the Jan Beasley, the avatar, the woman that was interviewing her on TV, her mother-in-law came in. And I didn't even know it was a mother-in-law. I was doing reflexology, and her husband had just died, so we started talking about, I said, yeah, I went through that. And the next thing I know, on TV, they're saying, oh, the lovely worker you've got, my mother-in-law. And I said, well, I don't know who your mother-in-law is. I said, I just talk to people. And anyway, she said, oh, she's coming in again. And anyway, she's saying, wear this clothes and wear that and do your hair. I felt like the Queen was coming in. But anyway, look, I really did enjoy that job, but she ended up dying of cancer, and I thought, well, what am I going to do now? So I ended up opening up a stall down the markets and doing card readings, and that went really well. There was another one there, and no one wanted to go to her. They were all lining up to see me. But and by this stage I'd had a bit of money, and a dream of mine was to have a horse again. But mind you, before that I was flying backwards and forwards to Brisbane because my mother had died, so I went to her funeral. My father was not well, and I was the only one that went near either of them. So I went up and looked after my father for 3 months, and I took James with me. And Daniel stayed, he was older, so he stayed in the housing trust. And luckily there was a childcare centre 2 doors up from where he lived, so I put James in there during the day so I could look after him. And he had one of his mates staying with him who was Jehovah's Witness, which, you know, I'm not judgmental to what anyone wants to believe. And he said, "Oh, you're totally different to your sister." He said, "I was really worried." I said, "What do you mean I'm different?" And he said, "Oh, she walked in, poked her nose in the air and then left." He said, "Whereas you come in and talk to us like we're human beings." And I said, "Oh." But anyway, that was good. He was really helpful. He looked after my father and I looked after him to give him a break and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, then he had to go into a nursing home, my father. And he still I used to ring him every week. And I knew he wanted to die. He said to me, he said, "I hate it in here." He said, "They're treating me as if I sank the Titanic." He said, "I just want to die." And I had learnt through the work I was doing. And I said, "Well, look," I said, I'll help you die." I said, "You have to look for the light." And I said, "Go to the light." I said, "You are going to die." And, you know, and he used to ring me every day. And 3 days later, he did die. And so I went up for his funeral. I was the only one crying. They didn't care less. All they were interested in was taking my inheritance because they were executors of the will, which they did do. And there was a lot of land involved. 80 acres had been sold and there was 100 acres left. And my mother left everything to my youngest brother, who wasn't my father's, whereas my father left it 4 ways. But they made sure all the money was spent while he was in the nursing home. And because he'd left the money to me and my sister and the land to my 2 brothers, because he was an honest person. He said, I said I'd raise him as my own. So he scored twice. My sister had bought all her kids a house with his money when he was in the nursing home. Her husband died of alcoholism, drinking. But you know, I learned in AA that if I hold on to resentments, I only hurt myself. And it did hurt. But, you know, sometimes you just have to accept. I could have contested the will, I suppose, but I just came back to Adelaide and, they wiped me off Facebook. They didn't want nothing to do with me after that. So that was it, you know. I had built a different life for myself down here. And so another friend of mine, actually, he was a really good friend. He was actually a member of, but he was a very nice man. Not that I was with him or anything, I just knew him through another friend. And he had a son in a wheelchair in a care facility who he used to look after, and through an accident. And we were just friends. He didn't drink or smoke or do anything like that. So he came over one day, he said, look, I'm going on the poker run with that. He said, would you come as the pillion? And I said, yeah, all right. So Daniel and the girls looked after James. And that was great. I really enjoyed that. And we got back to the clubhouse and he said to all his mates, he said, no, he said, not this one. He said, this one's a good girl. I'm taking her home. So I don't know what they do. But I did enjoy that. And he's still a friend of mine today. He's dying. He's older than me. He's actually only spoke to him a couple of days ago. And I don't think he's got much longer to live. But I did stay in contact with him as a friend over 30 years. Anyway, that was another story. So what I did was a dream of mine was to have a horse again. So I looked around and I found some cheap land at Napa Beach. Oh, this would be, well, I spent about 18 years in Adelaide, and then I bought this land and I put up a big tin shed. Anyway, I met someone who was in a camper van, and he wanted somewhere to park his camper van. And I said, oh, well, you can't park on the other side of my land if you want. I had 5 acres. And I guess you'd call that a platonic friendship. And he was really good too, because him and I concreted the shed of the floor of the shed. They put the shed up, but we concreted the floor. And so he helped me do things, and he, had a gas shower, a gas fridge and a gas stove. But a lot of times in winter I just cooked on the outside fire, which I love doing. And then by then James was going to Napa Beach Primary School and living in the shed with me. And he had a motorbike he could ride round. And anyway, I bought my horse, and I kept saying to Phil, who was on the other side in his camper van, I said, this horse keeps getting fatter. I said, I think there's legs in there. He said, oh, don't be stupid. No one would sell you a horse that's pregnant. And I said, well, I don't know. I said, seems like it keeps getting bigger. And I was just over 50 by then. So it wasn't as if I was riding hard, and I'd just walk or canter or plod along. It just was one of my dreams to do that again. Anyway, I must have been down in Adelaide one weekend, and he's ringing me up and he says, oh, he says, you're a mother. I said, what do you mean I'm a mother? He said, the horse has got legs coming out of it. And I said, well, give him a bit of a tug then. Oh, couldn't believe it when I got back. There was another little foal running around. And he wasn't really into horses, but this horse he was into. He called it his baby. And he had dogs. So he he seemed to train it like a dog. When anyone had come into the yard, it'd run for him. I mean, I knew what to do. I just waved my hands and it'd go the other way. I didn't know what age you broke him in or anything, but anyway, I did end up breaking the horse in, and came off quite a few times, but it was rideable. And so then I had 2 horses, and James was always bringing his. By this time, Daniel had a job in the abattoirs up here in Port Perry before it closed down. He was a forklift driver, and the abattoirs closed down, and then he got a job at Golden North ice cream factory as a forklift driver. So he bought a house in Georgetown, moved over there to be near his work. And James would bring his mates home, and I said, well, they'd bring their sleeping bags with them, and I'd say, well, or little tents or whatever. I said, I'll go and find somewhere you can camp out. And so they said, oh, well, what about your horse? And I said, oh, James knows what to do. James would ride them. And of course, when I first moved up to Nababy, I made sure that there was an AA meeting I could go to, because camaraderie. I had so many friends in AA, I was just so blessed, because, and I still do have so many friends in AA. And and it's just been part of my life. I mean, I some of them I've known 30 odd years, and or some, just a lot of friends. And I also have friends that I sponsor that ring me when they need help, so it's sort of a camaraderie type of a situation where we're all trying to better our lives. So I went and found the AA meeting in Port Perry, and there was 2 old blokes, and they said, oh, well, it's slowed down a bit and we're getting old. And I said, oh, well, I'm happy to come along. And I'll probably, over the 20 years that I have been running, because they both passed away, so then I took over, I've seen hundreds of people come through, and there's a few that have stayed sober for long periods of time, but I can't help someone if someone doesn't want to help themselves. So I do continue to do that on a Thursday night here in Port Perry at 7 p.m, just round the corner at the Seventh-day Adventist Church Hall. And they've been very supportive. Another friend of mine that I've known for over 20 years, he's moved up this way, so that's good. He comes along. And and the 12 steps, as I was saying, we make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand God. I mean, there's no rule on that. I mean, I've had some woman come in and she said, oh, my higher power's called Gus. And I said, oh, well, that's fair enough. No one has to have the same. And she said, Gus to me is great universal spirit. And I said, oh, that's good. So the other friend of mine, Henry, he makes a joke if we have any problems. He says, "Oh, we'll ask us." But anyway, so there are no rules. I mean, all you've got to do is stay sober. But if you choose to work the steps, you can get a look at yourself and get a better life. One of the steps, which is a harder one, which is writing down all your resentments, all your fears, your sex conduct when you're drinking, and looking at all this stuff, which I did with my sponsor, and I was so embarrassed because I had it all written down, and the fifth step is to share it with God and to another person. So I did share all this, and it really does clear your mind, you know, because it gets all the past out of your head. Because AA is an inside job where we work on the inside, and then you humbly ask God to remove your defects of character, which you find out what they are in working the steps. And then you go down to making a list of all the people you had harmed when you're drinking, or any time for that matter. And of course my mother was one on top of my list. This is when I was in Adelaide, and she was still in the nursing home at that stage. And I thought, oh, I'm going to have to do this. I had to ring some of my exes. Anyway, I wrote a brief letter to her telling her that I loved her and that I was sorry if I hurt her. And I just kept it fairly simple. And I didn't want to post it. I had it in my handbag. And I thought, no, I can't post it. And anyway, I shared about this at a meeting. I said, I've got this letter that I've got to send to my mother. I said, but I can't bring myself to send it. I said, but I'm sure I will one day. Anyway, after the meeting, this woman came up to me and she said, give me the letter, Maralyn. I said, what for? And she said, I'm going to post it. I said, no. I said, I'll get around to it. She said, give me the letter. So I gave her the letter, and she obviously put a stamp on it and posted it. I couldn't believe it. 3 weeks later, I got the phone call that my mother had died. You know, and I thought, well, maybe she was waiting to hear where I ended up, even though she was in a nursing home and I didn't know whether she could understand anything or anything. But when I went to the funeral, I did ask some of the nurses that went there, and they said yes, she kept pointing to the letter that she wanted us to read it to her again. So I thought, well, you know, that's a high-powered job that someone got that letter off me and sent it. So, you know, I don't have any regrets really. I mean, if I hadn't have done that stuff and became an alcoholic, I wouldn't have found how to be a better person and to look at myself and things I needed to change. And yes, it has been a sad journey at times because people die, and not all the older members that helped me, most of them have passed away, and other people pass away because they can't stay sober or off drugs, and but you know, all I can do is do the best I can for my life and my children. James has never seen me drink, never ever. He knows that I call myself a recovering alcoholic. And the funny thing is too, when I went down, I'm probably jumping all over the place now,
Okay.
but when I went down to look after my father, I found in a box these books, and they were AA books. And I said, where did these books come from? And he said, my father was in AA. I said, I didn't know that. And he said, oh, well, I didn't think to tell you. And I said, can I have those books? He said, yes, of course you can. And one of them, he was one of the first 20 in Brisbane to get sober. A woman called Lillian Roth bought AA from America to Australia. Anyway, he wrote a thing in this book, this magazine thing, and then I got down to Adelaide and I just kept it, you know, and someone was yelling out at meetings, if anyone's got any old literature from years ago, could you please hand it in? So I handed this book in and they sent it back to Queensland to put in the archives. Anyway, things like that happen, but I continue to believe that there is some sort of higher power up there looking after me, because I should have been dead by rights. But I didn't die. I changed my life. I mean, one funny thing, well, I don't know, it's probably not funny, but when I first got sober and I'm out of the rehab, you could piece it backwards and forwards, but because I was a shoplifter, and of course I wanted to change that because I didn't want to do those things anymore, but I didn't know what to do. I'd go into a shop and I'd get the urge and I'd have to get out. And so I didn't go into shops. I could go into food shops because that wasn't a big issue, but I couldn't go into clothes shops or anything like that, or I didn't want to. And because after I got out of the rehab, I was probably about 8 months sober, and it didn't think in my mind that it was an addiction of another addiction. And I walked into a shop and I put some clothes into my handbag, and I thought, oh shit, I shouldn't be doing this. And I thought, oh, what am I going to do? And I'm thinking, do I walk out? Do I not walk out? What do I do here? And I knew a floor walker was onto me, and I thought, oh, I'm going to have to let myself get caught here, I thought, because otherwise I don't know how I'm going to stop doing it. So I did get caught and I got put in the cells because I didn't have an address to tell at the time. And anyway, I fronted court and the judge said, why did you do it? I said, because I was running on my own will instead of running on God's will. And he said, well, I've never heard that one before. He said, let her go. But I never did it again after that. You know, maybe that was what needed to happen. You know, because it's very hard to break habits that you get into. But yeah, so Daniel's got the house at Georgetown. I'm out at Napperby and never had enough money to put a house up. But I did love living out there. And then I used to ride my horse up to the Napperby Scouts camp. And I said to a few people, I said, oh, this would be a good place to have an AA camp. I said they could camp all over the place in their cars or whatever they want to do, and I think there was 36 beds in there. So we had an AA camp up there, I think it was in October, and this was maybe 15, 18 years ago, and it's still, somebody still runs it now today. So it still happens, so that's always something that I go to. By this stage, I think James had moved over with Daniel into his house. He was a teenager then. Myself and the friend that lived in the land with me, each winter for 5 years down here, I'd go up to Darwin in my little caravan. And I loved being up in Darwin, but he had a tinny with him at one point, because we didn't stay in caravan parks. We went bush. And he said, oh, come on, he said, we'll get in the tinny in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, and we'll go down to the sea and see if we can catch some barra. And I said, well, there's crocodiles all along the bloody banks. He said, oh, don't worry about them. I said, well, how do you know? And he said, no, he said, they'll just stay there. I said, all right. So we're in this titty and we get down to the ocean. We didn't catch any barra. And by the time we got back, the tide was out. There was about that much water under the boat. And what happened? All the crocodiles came down. I said, well, what are we going to do now? He said, get the oar. And he said, we're going to have to dig ourselves out. I said, well, there's crocodiles everywhere. And he said, well, put the oar in between them and we've got to start digging ourselves out. And, you know, I didn't have time to be scared. I just did what we had to do. And in the end, we couldn't get out. And I said, well, I'm lying on the bottom of the boat. I don't know what he did. Until the tide comes in again. Oh, I got out of that one alive. I said, I've had enough of Darwin now. But anyway, I got back and I thought, no, time to sell Napperby. I might be able to buy a house in Port Perry. I'm not getting any younger. The first house I looked at, which was this one, I offered the most ridiculous price that no one thought I'd get it. Neither did I. And then they came back and said I could have it. So I just bought the first. I just thought, oh well, I'll just buy this house. And this is where I stay. I continue to go and see Becky, and Becky's now got a daughter, and I call her my granddaughter, and Daniel's daughter, who they stopped us from seeing her when the relationship broke up, but Daniel sees her now sometimes. Jasmine. I was going along quite happily, and then I started to get pain in my right hip, few years ago now, and it got to a point where I actually couldn't walk. I had to use a walking frame. And the stupid doctor I was going to said, "Oh, you'll be right on that walking frame." And I'm thinking, well, what am I going to do? And he said, "Oh, I can't concentrate while you're talking." But anyway, eventually I did have a hip replacement, but then they got an infection in it, so I went to Becky's place and she looked after me. She lives in Adelaide in a housing trust. She stayed. She met a boyfriend when she was 14, and she's now nearly 40 and she's still with him today. And she's got one daughter, that's Shayla. I said, "Oh, Becky," I said, "the bloody thing's leaking again." So I had to go back to hospital again. 3 times they opened me up in the same spot. I was on all these strong antibiotics and I was in pain. Anyway, I thought, no, I need to go home. So I rang Daniel. I said, "Look, I'm coming home," I said, "but I'm not in a real good way." And he said, "Well, look, I'll move in with you." By this stage, James is in Adelaide. So he moved in with me. He's already owns his house, so he left his job. He said, "I'm not worried about working anymore." So he came and looked after me, and I was in bed for about 12 months actually. I was on the walking frame and depressed, and I'm thinking, oh, this is the end of me. I'm going to be like this for the rest of my life. And anyway, he said, "Well, I'll bring your tea into the bedroom." I said, "No, I want to try and get up and start walking a bit." So anyway, I went to physio and they didn't do much. Eventually I went to another physio in Thrive, and he was fantastic. He really was. He said, you're using, because by this stage I was on a walking stick. And he said, "You're using your stick in the wrong hand." He said, "You use it in the opposite hand to where your problem is." I said, "Oh." So I had to practice that, and I started walking, and he said, "Look, how are you in water?" I said, "All right." "Why?" He said, "Well, can't you do exercises in water?" So that's when I joined water aerobics here in Port Perry, which I really enjoy and still do today. I was doing 3 times a week, sometimes 2 times a week, but it wasn't long, a couple of months, and I did start feeling better and walking better, and I do yoga as well, and I continue to help people with alcohol problems or alcohol or substance abuse. And my son stayed with me for a couple of years, Daniel, and he's not long moved back to his house. He had someone staying in his house while he was over here with me. But we're very close. I'm very close to both my sons, and I'm very grateful. I mean, Daniel chooses to stay single. I think he had enough of kids when he was a teenager, looking after 2 babies. Funnily enough, Tim, he met in primary school, his mother ended up in Gladstone and South Australia, and now in a unit or a little place in Port Perry, and so him and Daniel still are very good friends. I think they like going down to see a sex worker every now and then when they have a bit of money. I think that's their thing. James is single. He has a mental illness. He's in hospital, well, it's called a hospital, even a rehab in Adelaide, and Daniel and I go down to see him every couple of weeks. He's been there for a long time. He's been diagnosed now with schizophrenia. So I don't know what the answers are. I mean, Daniel's the one that went through my drinking with me. James has never seen me drink. I talk to his psychiatrist all the time. I mean, he hasn't got it too bad down there. He's got 3 meals a day and roof over his head, people to talk to. And he gets his NDIS worker to take him out twice a week. He seems to be into tattoos now. And I said, please don't get one on your face. And he said, no, I won't, Mum. I thought, oh, thank God for that. But anyway, we went down to Daniel drives because I don't drive long distances. We went down and saw him for Christmas and gave him a few presents, and he was coming up here each year for Christmas, but this year he's not allowed to because they're trying to work out putting him in. He was going to come and live with me, but now they're saying I'm too old, and I think they're going to put him in a share place with some worker there to supervise. So it will be good because I can go and visit him whenever I want. He can come here whenever he wants. And that's how I ended up with his pit bull. Because he said, I'm getting a pit bull. I said, oh, do you have to get one of them? Yes. So, but having said that, now that I've had him for 5 years, I'm very happy. He's a very good guard dog and he's very friendly. I don't know, I just heard bad things about pit bulls, but I actually wouldn't know what I'd do without him now because he sleeps with me every night. And life goes on, and I don't know how much longer I've got left, but I've done everything I've wanted to do in my life, and I'm very happy that I'm close to my 2 sons and my foster daughter Becky and Tim, who's in Port Perry now, who comes over quite a bit. Life's good, and that's my purpose in life, to help other people with addiction problems, because I understand, because I didn't get it out of a book, I lived it. That's what I do. And I'm very, very grateful that I found a beautiful life in South Australia and that I ended up with 2 beautiful sons and 2 granddaughters and an extra daughter and an extra son, Tim, and a house. When I think of the fact that I ended up in South Australia with a handbag, I have come a long way. So that's about my story.